Good evening and welcome to the March 1st, 2012 meeting of the City of West Sacramento Planning Commission. As tradition, we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I am going to ask Mr. Galvan to lead us. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Thank you. Just a note, if you would like to address the commission tonight, there are slips to be filled out. Please hand it to the clerk, and she will bring it up to me. First item on the agenda is presentations by public on matters that are not on the agenda, and I have no request to speak this evening. Second is correspondence and staff communications. So, Mr. Tilley.
Yes. Good evening, Chair Liebig, members of the Planning Commission. We don't have any direct correspondence for you tonight. Just want to report that City Council last week met in its annual strategic planning session, and those results are being tabulated, and as soon as we have those, we'll let the Planning Commission know what this year's management and policy agenda will be and what the Planning Commission's role may be in implementing those items. And so that's an annual event and is an important one. And you'll be seeing in relationship to those various agenda topics, and considered in the various staff reports that will be coming through to you as they pertain to the items that are under the Planning Commission's normal topics of discussion. So with that, that's no more communications tonight.
Okay, thank you. Next on the agenda is disclosure of ex parte communications. However, this time I would probably note that there's only staff items on the agenda, so I'm assuming none. Moving on to the consent agenda, if anybody has any discussion.
I'd make a motion that we approve the minutes.
I'll second that.
Moved by Mr. Moore, seconded by Ms. Sandine. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Hearing none. Were there any abstentions? Don't think so. Okay. Moving on to the regular agenda, we have a public hearing regarding Resolution 12-1 PC regarding amendments to the zoning ordinance, and this will be given by Ms. White.
Good evening, Chairman Liebig and members of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission conducted a public workshop on the proposed amendments on February 2nd, and staff also met with the Chamber of Commerce on February 8th to talk about the proposed amendments. And based on the feedback staff received from the Planning Commission and the Chamber, changes have been made to some of the proposed amendments that I would like to just briefly highlight. We introduced an amendment regarding screening for rooftop equipment for remodels and expansions, and both the Commission and the Chamber requested staff to clarify when a remodel would trigger screening. That language has been changed, stating that a 50% increase or expansion in the floor area will trigger screening, and that remodeling with less than 50% expansion of the existing floor area will trigger screening where feasible. And I need to mention that that change is not reflected in the draft ordinance, and that language should be included in the document. Secondly, we had recommended that the metal storage containers be prohibited in the residential zones, and the Planning Commission requested staff to develop some language that will allow the metal storage containers on a temporary basis, and so we've included language stating that containers would be allowed on a temporary basis in connection with a valid building permit. And this would be allowed in any zone in the city on a temporary basis. We introduced a new definition for firearms dealer broker. The Planning Commission asked staff to allow storage, to revise the definition to allow storage of the firearms and related equipment that's needed to complete the transaction, and so the definition has been revised to allow the incidental storage of the firearms and equipment. The ordinance includes language stating that approvals for variances, conditional use permits, and plan development permits expire if the project has not commenced construction within 1 year of the date of the approval or within the time limit set by the Planning Commission. And since the zoning ordinance does not include a similar clause for design review permits, staff is recommending similar language for design review permits. We took this to the chamber, and the chamber requested that based on the current economic climate, that they would like to see the time extended from 1 year to 2 years, not only for design review permits, but for all other discretionary permits that the Planning Commission would review, which would include the plan development permits, conditional use permits, and variances. And so we revised the language to extend that timeline from 1 year to 2 years when time limits are not otherwise established by the Planning Commission. This concludes my presentation, so staff is recommending that the Planning Commission conduct a public hearing and adopt Resolution 12-1, PC recommending that the City Council adopt proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance. Are there any questions for me?
Thank you, Sandra. Are there any questions before I open the public hearing? Seeing none, at this time I will open the public hearing, but because we have no request to speak, I will close the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for deliberation. And I will look to my left for any questions, comments first. None. Okay. As Sandra said, we recently visited this on February 2nd, so I imagine there would be fewer comments this time.
Actually,
Joe?
I do have one question. So Sandra, when I remember one of the points of discussion was when the screening for would be triggered on existing buildings, and we had some concerns that maybe it would be an undue cost to folks when they were just remodeling the interior. So I'm still a little confused. So I understand if there's a 50% or more increase in the building size. Are we saying that, say we have a strip mall, and inside that there may be two or three businesses. If they remodel the interior of one of those businesses to fit an incoming tenant, will they be required to screen up top? Because they would be remodeling the interior, they wouldn't be expanding, but they'd.
Well, that's where we put in the where feasible language. And because it presumably for a very small TI like that, the cost of the screening relative to the cost of the work probably would make that infeasible. But we certainly want to make sure we're trying to catch this on existing buildings to the extent possible, because virtually all new buildings are built with this in, from the get-go. It's really a non-issue. But existing buildings typically have not had sufficient parapet height and roof screening to be able to, screen those type of equipment. So we tried to give the, where feasible, which is an out for smaller projects.
So there's no real definition of where feasible. That'll just be a discussion of the expansion and the building and.
Yeah, and again, it's something we would also work out with the building official about the structural requirements for, on an existing building, things like that. So it's something we really want to be able to look at in the context of those projects.
Mr. Chase?
Actually, it would be a question for Sandra. You mentioned the chamber, I guess, asking for the period, the design review, to be extended from 1 year to 2 years. The 1 year is still in the documents and the ordinance. Is it the proposal that this would be modified to be 2 years? Or?
For design review permits, we don't have a similar language. So we, at the last workshop, we introduced language which is similar for permits, like conditional use permits and plan development permits. And so the chamber just honed in on, they'd like to see just, the 1 year extended to 2 years for all permits because of the economic climate. And so we concur with that recommendation, thought it was a reasonable request. And so we're just recommending that that 1 year period be extended to 2 years for all discretionary permits, including design review permits, which are reviewed by staff at staff level.
Okay, so if we approve this tonight, we should have, that should be a condition. We approve it with that.
The language, the ordinance includes the changes for those other
okay.
discretionary permits as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm still back on the swimming pool issue. And again, I agree that the pool needs to be set back, but did we discuss about the equipment that runs the pool and whether that's considered the pool or not?
The setbacks for pool equipment are identified, separately from the pool itself, in the zoning ordinance.
So the pool equipment could be up by a fence line? The filter
If
or
it was
whatever.
less than 3 feet from the property line, it would need to be in a soundproof enclosure.
You know, again, David, that's the issue that was out there. I think that's what the chambers talked to you about. It, you know, according to what's on this document here on page 2, where they were saying, you know, one of the things we did in Southport was encourage smaller lots. When we encouraged the smaller lots, we knew we were going to incur some of that. While I agree that the idea of having the pool needs to be set back into a person's yard, I just think we need to have a little discretionary effort here so that if they have to have a pump or whatever outside, I mean, where are you going to put it? In the middle of the backyard? I mean, it's got to go off to the side somewhere so it looks good. And that's what we've allowed in the past, and I just want to make sure that that's what we're going to be able to allow currently.
Yeah, well, we aren't proposing any changes to the existing language in the zoning ordinance related to the pool equipment itself.
Okay, well, I think that's real important because almost everyone's pool equipment that I've seen in any home in Southport has had to go up against a fence just to be out of the way. Or you'd have to put it in the middle of the backyard, and that doesn't seem very encouraging. But I think we need to have that option remain open for people.
To have the pool equipment closer?
Well, I just don't see a problem in putting the pool equipment, you know, which is a filter or a pump or whatever you call them, by the fence line. That's not going to kill anything. I just think the pool itself has to be within the structure. I think the equipment, though, with some of the small lots, I just don't know where you'd put the equipment.
Yeah, well, we agree that the pools need to maintain the appropriate setbacks, and that's why we are recommending that pools not be eligible for zero lot line agreements, because those have produced problems in the real world for the few that we have done. But that's related to the pool itself. We aren't proposing to change setbacks for pools or for their equipment. This is only to make pools ineligible for the zero lot line agreement.
Okay.
Mr. Chase?
Just to follow up on that, David, could I ask for clarification on what the pool regulations are, you know, 3 feet versus closer to? You mentioned soundproof enclosure or some,
Currently, pools have to be located 5 feet from property lines.
the pool
And-
itself does?
Yes, the pool
okay.
itself, we measure from the water line.
Okay.
As far as the pool equipment, they have to be located 3 feet from the rear or side property line, or if within 10 feet from the living area of any dwelling unit, they have to be enclosed in a soundproof enclosure. So the language that's before you is dealing with just the pool itself. In my staff report, I mentioned that my recollection is that we've only processed 2 zero lot lines for pools. One pool was located in Southport. For all the other pools, permits we have, building permits we have reviewed for pools, it does, you know, locating the pool equipment has, you know, in compliance with the zoning ordinance has not seemed to be a problem at all. So.
Just following up to Charlie's comment, I think I totally agree with the pool. I think needing to be kept back because of, you know, footings, other issues that could impact and grading. But the pool equipment itself, I would think, and I agree in a small lot, that if it could be located in the corner or adjacent to a rear or side fence line, I don't think it would add any more of a sound, you know, imposition on adjacent property, whether it's 3 feet away or up against the fence. And I would agree that it is a way, as lots get smaller, you know, we're going to need to probably push things out to the edges. And I know it's not what's before us right now, but I would hope that we can find a way to allow pool equipment, I think as Charlie suggested, to be, you know, closer or adjacent to the property line, not need to maintain a 3-foot setback while the pool should, or 5 foot.
If that's where the, you know, commission would want to go on this, we would have to have a different, you know, have another ordinance change to, you know, reduce or eliminate that 3-foot setback requirement.
Ms. Endine?
And I personally would prefer to take that up, probably not with this. I know we're reviewing it now, but I think there's issues with a zero lot line actually being the wall of someone's home. That's the line. So I think we'd have to be really careful if someone put the pool equipment up against someone else's house, because that sometimes is the zero lot line. if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, we do have several zero lot line plotted homes, particularly like down in Bridgeway Lakes, in the Bridgeway Lakes 2 area. So that zero lot line is literally the wall of the person's home.
So I think we just have to, my thought is, I understand, trying to figure out
I don't
how
wanna
to,
tie
how
it
to
to
allow
this
folks that
tonight.
have smaller lots to have amenities like the rest of us, if it's, or other residents, if it's possible, but I also think we'd have to just understand a little bit more the implications of just making an above the board, or you can put pool equipment when it actually is a wall, or we just have to understand it more.
And I'm fine, I don't mean it to bring it into this, the discussion of this ordinance tonight.
Well, it seems like we're covering it now, Beverly, but I mean, I think the point that I'm trying to make is, with the smaller lots, you don't have a lot of options. And I'm just saying, let's at least, I mean, the equipment, even if you have to have a zero lot line agreement with your neighbor, which wouldn't want it by your bedroom, but if it's out in the yard and away from the actual home itself, you're probably better off to have it up against the fence, which will defer the sound back towards you, rather than to have it 3 or 5 feet out in the lot and then have it be able to go over. I'm just trying to make it, it has no effect on me. I'm not going to build a pool out there. But just for the few people we've had, I recall that we discussed this before, and it became, well, you can't put the pool, well, you don't want the pool there next to the house because of structural things. There's something about going so deep and you don't want to have it near the house. But the equipment is totally different, and I just don't want the two to be tied together, because you should have that option to go up against a fence somewhere. Otherwise, it's in the middle of the yard. And that, whether we take it up later, that's fine. And maybe it's, if you can get a zero lot line agreement, it's okay. If you can't, then you have to put it into some structure. But I just don't know how you put it in a structure for that kind of stuff.
Okay. Just for clarification, I don't want to dwell on this, but our action tonight does not affect someone's ability to get a zero lot line adjustment for pool equipment, correct? So they are still able to do this.
They still would be able to do that. That is correct.
If there should be a problem in the future, I'm sure the commission may wish to address it.
I agree.
Okay.
I'm just bringing it up as my point.
Okay. And
Since we can't talk about signs on tall buildings, that's,
I'm still patiently waiting for that. Are there any other questions down there? I had a history question. It had to do with bees. I'm not looking for anything change-wise, but why are bees considered wild, exotic, dangerous, or otherwise prohibited? Does anybody know? Okay.
The dangerous part I can answer, I got stung by a swarm when I was a kid.
Yeah, pretty
Well, they're grouped in with geese and something else, and I was just kind of a little stumped by this. Peacocks, I understand. Roosters, I understand. Geese, I have them by my house, and I totally understand.
Generated to the beekeeper.
But bees, I just didn't know. And so I could see us in the future maybe seeing a request to have that loosened up, but I won't do that right now. So. Okay. If there are no other comments, the public hearing has been closed, and so I will seek out a motion.
I'll move the recommended action.
Moved by Ms. Sandine,
Second?
seconded by Mr. Chase. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. White. Moving on to item number 3, which is a public workshop regarding urban parking requirements. Also, presentation given by Ms. White tonight. Or Mr. Tilley, who looks like he's ready to speak.
Yes, I just wanted to let the commission know that we have a guest appearance by Maureen Pasco from the Public Works Department this evening. She's going to give the Planning Commission, which will be a refresher for some of you and new information for some of the newer commissioners. It's been a few years since this presentation has been given about where the city has been going and parking on a holistic level. And then Sandra and myself will add some discussion for you as well, but based on some of the stuff in the staff report. But we're going to begin with Maureen tonight, and she does have a PowerPoint for you.
Good evening. The reason that this is called a refresher, which you'll see in the slideshow in a moment, is because I made a very similar presentation to the Planning Commission in November of 2008, and I realized not only were some of you not present for that, but it's also been a pretty considerable lag between that time and that presentation, and now we're getting down to implementation. And so just to make up for that lag, then I'm coming back to you now. At that time in November of 2008, we had just completed our comprehensive parking study for the city, for the urban areas of the city. And we presented it to the Planning Commission. I believe I presented it to EDAC as well. And we went to the City Council and got acceptance of these recommended policies and actions at each point along the way. So as I said, that lag of 3 years to get to implementation in part reflects that we haven't really needed to enact a lot of these now, but the need is becoming more apparent as we're completing the improvements in the Bridge District. So the areas that we addressed in that parking study were the neighborhoods you see in front of you, the Washington, the Bridge District, and the West Capitol Avenue Civic Center area. And the parking study really only addressed commercial and mixed uses. So we had, just a few months before the completion of the parking study, had adopted changes to the residential parking standards. And so we excluded that from the study, but I believe that there may be some other adjustments based on what we know about actual plan development in the Bridge District now. So when we come back to you, there will probably be some adjustments to residential standards. But what I'm going to be talking about tonight really mostly just applies to commercial. So why we identified a need that we had to look at what our parking policies and standards were because if we looked at what parking demand in the Bridge District would be based on the projected uses and tried to surface park all of it, it would use up 30% of the land area within the Bridge District. Not only would that be just a tragic waste of really valuable property, it would also be completely contrary to the kind of urban vision that we have for the Bridge District and the kind of neighborhood that we're trying to create. It would not support the transit-oriented, mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented, transit-friendly, all of the ideals that we have expressed for that neighborhood. And I apologize because we're recycling some of the slideshow. We have the old land use plan, but this slide was really just to illustrate that we're looking for really a higher density, more intense kind of development within the Bridge District, that we already are providing a fair amount of transit, and we're planning on a much higher level and quality of transit and working on extending the streetcar line through here. So given the desire or the understanding that we weren't going to be able to surface park all of the demand within the Bridge District, we identified the demand, projected that, and then identified locations where that might be accommodated. So the numbers associated with each of the little purple blocks here indicate the capacity. And these really are just conceptual locations. The objective was to provide a parking facility that was located within a couple blocks of every use. So you never had to go too far, at least not at build out, to get to a parking facility. To arrive at the level of demand that we derived, we started by adjusting what the parking requirements might be. So the flat blue line at the top shows what the city's current parking requirements are. That's our minimum parking requirement for commercial uses. And you'll see that it's actually higher than the rate required in the Institute of Transportation Engineers. Now, the ITE standards have come under a lot of criticism in recent years because they were based on surveys that were conducted during the 50s and 60s in suburban office parks. And so they were already really very high inflated standards anyway, considering that they assumed everybody was driving to work and there wasn't any transit service available and there weren't any other uses surrounding there, or compatible uses around them. So to have ours even higher that in an urban environment really didn't make sense. So we adjusted that to reflect the more denser urban environment that we're talking about building. That's the orange line that you see. And then the further adjustment downward from there was intended to reflect the level of transit service and the mixed-use nature of the planned development within the Bridge District and the other urban neighborhoods. The other thing I want to point out about this table is that we're looking at adjusting the standards over time so that initially in the first phase of development within these urban neighborhoods, we're anticipating that we won't necessarily have the full mix of uses or the full range of transit services available, and so that it will be necessary to provide more parking early on, but that those standards will decline as time goes on, and we are able to actually provide the parking structures and the facilities and the shared parking programs and the higher level of transit service and the mixed uses. So this graphic illustrates the build-out program that we assumed to calculate the future demand. So, up to the first 2 million square feet of use within the Bridge District in the first phase, and additional increment of another 1 million square feet in the second phase, and then the final in the third. And then this graphic represents the actual parking supply within each of those phases. And what's curious about this is that the parking supply actually declines in the third phase. And the mix of the parking, whether it's provided at the curb, in surface lots, or in parking garages, structures, also changes over time. So in the third phase, we're projecting lesser demand because we have the mixed uses and the services available. And we're also projecting that nearly all of the parking will be provided in structures in the third phase. So you'll see in the first phase, we're actually anticipating a lot of the parking being provided in surface lots. And we'll talk a little bit later about the details of that we're really anticipating surface lots will be a temporary use. One of the reasons that we think that things will really change in the future is that we'll be picking up a much greater share of trips with alternate modes. We took a really conservative approach in projecting demands and assumed that the first and second phase would have relatively lower share of total trips made by alternate modes, but then it really jumps up in the third phase at build out. Is this clear what's being illustrated here? Okay. And this is really just another illustration of the same thing, that the parking requirements decline in the third phase. So this next set of slides, we're really just going to be talking about some of the details that were recommended in the parking study and that are going to be reflected in the zoning changes that you'll be considering eventually. So, David, I don't know if you'd introduce this as the intent is to come back in April, is that right? With some actual suggestions for changes to the ordinances, but I'm here to sort of give you all the background and the wonky policy stuff that backs that up. So we went through this study by, establishing what our objectives really were, what we were trying to accomplish, which was really to support the kind of development we envisioned in urban neighborhoods, and then to achieve the only two real objectives that a parking program should have, and those are to prevent spillover effects into surrounding neighborhoods and to support the viable economic use that parking serves. So what that really means is that we're looking at protecting neighborhoods from having adverse effects of parking from surrounding areas or spilling over, that spillover effect. And we're looking at making sure the parking that we do provide serves a useful economic purpose for the uses that we're trying to support. So, in an example of this was if we were to make a lot of surface parking available within the Washington neighborhood or within the Bridge District to serve as a parking lot for downtown Sacramento. That's a viable economic use, maybe, but it's not serving the purposes that we're after. So anyway, we surveyed all of our baseline conditions. We forecast what the parking demand, the need would be in the future. We surveyed a lot of best practices from across the country and some great examples in the Bay Area. We have recommendations for a whole integrated transportation management program, of which parking is a very significant component, but it's matched up and helped along by transit policies, by flexible workforce hours, and a number of management policies that that are integrated and work together with the parking. Program development, meaning we identified places, likely places where parking garages would be provided and what their capacity might be. And we looked at the financing and the cost of actually providing those. So again, we were after taking an active approach to development parking and figuring out what we were going to be doing, and came up with a set of recommendations. So our baseline conditions, this is not very much changed from what it was 3 years ago. I still think that Raley Field is providing in the neighborhood of 1,800 spaces, all of them in temporary surface lots. The Washington neighborhood, there's a mix of curb parking, the Ziggurat Garage and the CalSTRS Garage. I will add that now in the Bridge District, what we didn't have 3 years ago is an awful lot of curb parking. And buried within here, I actually have a number, I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's in the study of how many curb spaces are available in the Bridge District. And in the West Capitol Civic Center area, we have an awful lot of off-street lots and curb parking available. We're not generating any revenue from any of the parking that's available, except indirectly the city does get a share of the revenue from the Ziggurat parking garage, but it's not dedicated to any particular purpose. It's just going into the general fund right now. And then in general, our demands for parking are being accommodated very locally. So each provider is meeting their own parking demand. The one exception to that might be here in the Civic Center area. We can discuss that in more detail if you'd like. And then the standards, the parking requirements and so on that we're providing now are generally a very suburban kind of standard. So looking at what our future needs, we looked at what adjustments we might be making to the actual demand and consequently our parking requirements, anticipating progressively increasing density as the waterfront and downtown areas develop, trying to apply some parking best practices to what we have and making good use of our existing supply. So we also tried to forecast what it would take to build and finance and how we would finance the construction of parking garages and test their financial feasibility. So I think I outlined for you but previously how we made adjustments to the ITE standards and walked through that. And I don't know how much detail you want to go into about this. I'm going to buzz through this right now because this is really data heavy, wonky. I love talking about parking though, so anytime you want to, I will just go into all that detail you'd like. But our resulting demand rates were significantly lower than what we are providing now. And one thing I really want to emphasize is that we're trying to create a market-sensitive, demand-responsive parking program. So right now, what we have is a very market-insensitive parking program. A parking minimum is basically telling developers, you must provide more parking than you would otherwise. So, most developers will come in here and say, well, in order to make my business financially viable, I need to provide 100 spaces, but our requirements are that you provide 150. So generally, our parking standards are requiring more parking production than the market requires. And The reason we do that is because we want to make sure there's none of those externalities. But the market has determined that our minimums are actually beyond what is necessary to assure the financial viability of the intended use. So what we're aiming to do is sort of bring this together back to those two principles I described, which is avoid spillover effects, prevent spillover effects, and support the financial viability. So we want to stay very closely in touch with the market and what developers actually need and what they find is necessary to serve their developments. So what this means is that there's necessary changes to the accessibility and the proximity provisions that are in the current code. So it means that there will provide parking in garages. It's not necessarily going to be on the same site as the building you're developing. And you can have surface parking, but it will be temporary, and eventually you'll need to participate in financing a garage. And then the best practice, this is the whole range of transportation demand management policies that go along with it. We're not actually going to be addressing many of these in the code changes that'll come to you next month. These are part of a sort of a bigger, broader policy approach that we're coming at in a lot of different directions. So providing the streetcar, trying to adopt some transportation management plans for major developments, incorporating standards for making developments pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly. We're coming at this from a lot of different directions, so this won't be addressed directly in the code changes that you're seeing. But these should resonate. These should be familiar kind of policies because they're showing up in the specific plans. Let me go back. So these are the kind of adjustments that we made to the existing parking requirements and the the considerations that we used in making those adjustments. And this was our projection of what total demand for parking would be at build out of each of the three neighborhoods. So I have, I'm not sure if it's in the slideshow also, but we also showed what our existing supply was compared to this. And you'll see that the greatest demand for additional parking is in the Bridge District. That's not a big surprise. That there's a fairly, there's probably a need for another garage at build out in the Washington District, and that might be accommodated by what CalSTRS does, it might not. And that we actually have more than enough parking in the Civic Center area. There it's mostly a question about management, how we use the parking that's available and whether we can sort of collectivize it in some way. So this is summarizing what we projected about the land area that would be required for parking and what we would anticipate costs would be to provide that within the Bridge District and the Washington neighborhoods. So maintaining flexibility through implementing this is a really key element of being able to afford the parking that we need to provide, as well as adapting to the kind of development that's occurring at any, hence we're looking at the standards adjusting as we go through build out. We're looking at allowing people to park off-site. We're looking at service lots evolving into garages. So what that flexibility means that we're looking at a build-out situation where we want to be in the end, but we're going to be getting to that point gradually, and that our policies are going to need to evolve as we go along through that 20-year process. So that how we're meeting demand, I'm not sure what I meant by that, but also that we will be partnering it with the private sector in providing the parking. So rather than having 100% public garages or 100% private parking. We're going to have probably a blend, and that we will probably have a blend in the management of those spaces as well. So sort of addressing the flexibility issues that I was talking about previously, and developing the funding for those. So the parking study concluded with a set of recommendations, the first of which was new code. So adjusting the planning codes to reflect these objectives, and that's the issue before you. But the other things that go along with this are instituting a parking program management structure that it may end up being a separate entity from the city. For now, it's me. But that what we do anticipate is establishing some sort of parking authority that would probably be a public-private entity that would involve the developers. It would probably initially probably just apply to the Bridge District, maybe to the Civic Center if we feel that we need to undertake some additional management issues here. The recommendation was that we do move ahead in doing this and start thinking about how we're going to build up our fund in order to be able to develop garages and provide these the parking management program that we need to do, to follow the best practices and implement some of those complementary transportation demand management measures, to have regular monitoring. This is particularly important to the spillover effect, that we need to make sure that that's not occurring, that we're addressing it where it does, and that we're responding to it with the necessary supplier, the necessary policies to stop it from happening. And to institute our funding mechanisms for
Maureen?
it. Yeah.
Just curious on that last slide.
Yeah.
The bullet point of charge ahead, there's an implication in there of electric charging stations? Or?
No, I think it was really, it was the think about how we're going to start collecting our funds. But that's a good point, particularly now that electric vehicles are becoming a much more commonplace, and that both the providers, SMUD and PG&E and SACOG, are pursuing the provision of charging facilities a lot more. So I think that it'll be very easy to incorporate that in. Yeah. Okay, where did I go? Can you get me back to that last slide, or the second to last one? There we go. That's the beginning, I think. Yeah. Oh, we get to go through. Just to recap. Yep. There you go. So there, I think that's really about everything that I wanted to present. David is better able to answer specifics about what some of the recommended code changes are. As I said, I love talking about parking, so I'm really happy to entertain your questions about the bigger picture.
Thank you, Maureen. David, did you have anything to add?
Yes, Sandra and I will have some comments specifically about that. I want to see if there's any questions regarding the information that Maureen presented before we go into that, or we can get into some more details.
Actually, I do have a question, I guess, or a comment. I'm not sure which. But wasn't the first time we tried to implement this parking policy when we built across the street at the Civic Center and the library and the school?
We did not actually adopt any changes to parking requirements for the Civic Center.
Yeah, we did.
Not in the code, not overall code. We, when we calculated the demand for the college, That was based on the figures that they provided us. And we also had in our agreement with Los Rios College that they would they would address the demand for parking in the first phase of development, in this phase, that it was actually their responsibility to provide parking. So the total amount of parking that's provided on site is consistent with what our code says and with what Los Rios had told us the demand would be. Now, what we did do was overlap some of the parking so that the demand for the community center is not independent or duplicative of what we're providing for the college. So we were anticipating that the hours of peak demand for the community center would be complementary with the college, and so that they would be able to share some of their parking. The library, on the other hand, is duplicative, so or cumulative. So the library is providing the amount of parking that our code requires for a library. Now, if you want to talk about what our actual experience has been, that's different.
Yeah, because it didn't work.
I would say that the problems that we have encountered in the Civic Center are primarily with management rather than supply. That the supply of parking within the Civic Center area is enormous, actually. And that we surveyed all of the parking that's available, public and private, and found that there's far more than is needed for the uses that are here today or in the future. The problem is that not all of it is right outside the front door. The further problem that we have with the college is that students are a really special case. They're a very unusual case because they're cheap. They are highly motivated to avoid paying for parking, and they're willing to go further to avoid paying for parking. And so that means that the parking that is supplied by the college, for which you do have to have and pay for a parking pass, goes unused. And that people instead are parking on the street or in the surrounding shopping centers. Now, and there's not necessarily a problem with parking in the surrounding shopping centers as long as there's excess supply there and people are parking in areas that aren't interfering with customer use. And most of the merchants have undertaken signage and enforcement programs, so it's accomplishing what it's supposed to do, which is support their businesses and their economic viability. And what we have done for all of the on-street parking, I think actually is working pretty well, where we have instituted really variable time limits on parking. So it didn't make sense at this point to install meters. It made more sense to time limit. So we have limits ranging from 60 minutes to 2 or 3 hours for all of the curb parking.
Well, the good part was we had that vacant piece of land that we were able to utilize. And that helped a lot. But I mean, part of the story that we were told at the Planning Commission level, and I recall this distinctly, is that we were told by the parking people that when we have the bus terminal there, that the terminal is where so many of the kids are going to come to college from. That's how it's going to work. That's why we don't need to have an abundance of parking over there like a normal school would have. But that turned out not to be true. It seemed like most every person that went to college drove a car, it seemed like, because we really had an abundance. Is it improving a little bit now that we opened that other lot? I know that we're getting less complaints than we did before.
I'm not getting them directly every day, but my impression is that we had a lot of problems in the first 6 months of operation of the college.
Right.
And then that dropped off with the second semester and dropped off further with the third semester. That progressively it's working better and fewer complaints as time goes on, that we're figuring out how to manage the parking that we've got.
And I think this brings me to my point of what you were talking about, is the library the community college, the whole group over there, is a primary example of why we want to implement this program so very slowly and make sure we have adequate parking in the very beginning. And then if we find that we can make it work as we progress through this project, which I'll be dead and gone by the time it's done, but I mean, and you'll be retired by then. But, you know, we want to make sure that we don't put something into implementation that truly isn't going to work, because everything seems to take a little bit of time. And I know a big portion of what we talked about over in the Bridge District was predicated on the fact that we were going to definitely have a trolley system going through there. And so, I mean, are we going to have a provision that we back off of that? Should we not have a trolley system? I mean, are you going to propose that in a month or so?
We have a lot of obligations to provide a superior level of transit service in the Bridge District beyond just the parking program. So we have that obligation to our funders through the Prop 1C grant. We have those obligations with the developers and so on through development agreements. So whether or not we have a streetcar serving all of the Bridge District at every moment, we will be providing a high level and high quality transit service there. It might not be in that form. And yes, I agree with you that we are looking at adjusting the parking requirements based on the alternatives that are available. So as that transit service improves over time, as the district gets more dense, then yes. But until all those pieces are in place, we will be having a higher requirement, a parking requirement.
That's what I recall
Yeah.
us talking about back then, that, you know, yes, we'd like to do this, but, you know, unfortunately, we get, you know, background things talking about San Francisco, which we're not, or New York City, which we're not,
No.
because everybody I know drives a car. We all drove a car here tonight, you know, until we have alternatives or people want to use alternatives, we still have to provide
Absolutely.
for that. So,
Yeah.
and that's a long process. It's not an overnight process.
You know, let me go back to look at what the parking demand in the Bridge District is, even with the reduced standards and so on, that we're still looking at several thousand stalls. So, you know, we fully anticipate there'll be people driving.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's not prohibited, and it will be accommodated.
Well, and one of my points is, you know, we've always made, or I've always thought of the Bridge District as being a destination point in the city for the River Cats, for whatever else we develop there. And so in order to encourage that, we want to make sure we have ample parking for the people that we're encouraging to come to our district. So,
Absolutely.
you know, I'm just not quite sure how we accomplish all of it, but I know that we're working towards that. I mean, we all are. We just got to make sure we have it all in place, but we have the safeguards to keep the older standards in until things start working.
And, you know, and I will again go back to the important parts of, you know, we need to provide parking, adequate parking, to make sure that we're not creating spillover effects and that we're supporting the viable uses, the ones that we want to have happen. And so that's why we really want to work closely with developers in determining how much parking they actually need in order to make their businesses successful, whether it's a retail or an office use, and whether it's at the beginning of the development of the Bridge District or at the end. So we want to remain responsive to that and flexible.
I applaud this stepped-in approach, and I appreciate the walking us through and reminding us how we got to this point. And I'm inferring from your comments that there is developer kind of interest or embracing of this approach. And I think they've invested so much time and energy in this huge project that I know it's a city policy. I know we have to determine what's right for us. But I also think it's important that we understand how they're seeing the business work, because I know from their perspective this has to work. You know, again, this is a lot of investment, a lot of time in the partnership with the city. So I think as this unfolds, I'll be interested in understanding their perspective in terms of if that's appropriate at this level. But it seems to me that they have to pencil out and make it work, and that's huge to me. And I know, again, you've inferred it or alluded to it, but I think that's important.
We're trying to be very sensitive to that. You know, some of the provisions that we're talking about right now for this initial phase, allowing curb parking for some of the residential uses temporarily, and allowing temporary surface parking lots, and so those are directly about making the development pencil out.
Okay, we'll pass it back to David and Ms. White.
So Sandra will provide some input, and then I'll close it out, and then we can ask more questions should you have them.
Concept that I'll introduce is what's called car sharing, and it's similar to car rental, with the main differences being that you can use the car sharing vehicle as little as a half hour a day, and the cars are located in the community rather than in a central parking lot that you would find for a car rental program. It requires membership in a car share program, and that membership provides access to a fleet of shared use cars, which is available on an as-needed basis, paying only for the time that the member uses the car and the mileage that they use for driving it. And the operators of the car sharing program provide the vehicle maintenance, the repair, and the insurance. And you're probably familiar with one of the car sharing organizations or programs, which is Zipcar, which is very active in San Francisco. I believe they have some, there's some membership in Sacramento and in UC Davis and the other cities in the country. And they're, according to some studies, car sharing reduces car ownership. It encourages more transit trips. It reduces the number of cars on the road, reduces pollution, saves gas, and provides for the more efficient use of parking spaces. We're looking at making some proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance that would encourage car sharing opportunities through new developments in exchange for parking reductions and or allowing car sharing vehicles to occupy a certain percentage of parking spaces in a private and or public parking garage. The second concept that we're looking at is commercial minimum maximum parking ratios. A number of cities have implemented, have begun to supplement minimal parking requirements with maximum parking requirements, and Maureen alluded to this in her presentation. Maximum parking requirements limit the number of parking spaces a developer can provide. So instead of asking developers to provide at least a certain number of parking spaces, developers will be asked to provide no more than a certain number of parking spaces. And so the maximum parking standards would reduce the amount of land paid over for parking, and the emphasis is shifting from away from designing buildings around cars towards designing buildings around people. Staff will be introducing proposed parking ratios for non-commercial uses in the urban districts, similar to the minimum maximum parking ratios that have already been adopted for the Bridge District. The third concept is what's called unbundled parking. Parking is often bundled, put together with the, what's the word I want to use, combined with the building costs, which means that a certain number of spaces are automatically included in a building purchase or a lease. And typically, parking spaces are included when a new resident leases or purchases a unit, so residents are basically forced to pay for parking even if they don't use it. Unbundling parking means that the parking is sold or rented separately. So, for example, rather than renting an apartment for $1,000 a month with 2 parking spaces and no extra costs, an apartment can be rented for $850 a month and parking is charged separately. So, for instance, you would, someone could charge $75 per month for each parking space. The tenant would only be required to pay for the parking space they actually use. So what happens with unbundling is that it allows for reduced parking requirements that actually, reflect the actual uses and reduces housing costs for residents who can meet their transportation needs using alternative modes of transportation like walking, biking, public transit, and even car sharing. And with that, I'll turn over the presentation to David. He'll talk about using on-street parking to satisfy some the required parking for residential uses.
Yeah, as Maureen mentioned in the beginning of her remarks, we've been working on implementation, but on this for some time now, but it's starting to get much more real because we expect the first projects to come out of the ground in the Bridge District, this year, hopefully toward, the middle to late summer. So everything we've been talking about through the Bridge District plan is starting to come to life. And so we're looking at things at a much more real world, basis. And what we're anticipating for those first couple of projects that come out of the ground is that they will not be able to provide sufficient parking, in a garage on site, in a podium structure. The costs to get to especially to a two-level podium, are cost prohibitive for these initial projects. And so they will provide some parking in a single-level podium for the first couple of buildings that will go out, but that will not be as much as we require currently, nor would we believe that's how much they would really need in the real world. So the typical alternative would be to just construct a surface lot somewhere, likely off-site, secure some ground, pave that, light it, et cetera, and maintain that for some period of time till other options become available. Given where we're at in the unique situation, the Bridge District, where we have basically constructed most of the streets up front with development to follow, there is a significant amount of on-street parking out there that is actually currently rarely even being used because currently it's signed for 90 minutes or less parking. We've been very careful about that to not become a parking lot for downtown Sacramento. And nor do we want Rayleigh Field event attendees to be parking on the street. We want those to continue going into those lots that are available, each year. So one of the things we will be bringing back to you when we come back on this is being a means by where projects will be able to make better use and more formal use of the on-street parking that's available in the Bridge District. That parking is out there, it's available, and there's little demand for it, at this point in time. Particularly with where the first few residential projects are to come out of the ground around Garden Park. This is going to be really a residential cluster with really no commercial in that area, so we're not anticipating having commercial customer demand in that area. So it makes sense that parking be available, since it's really that on-street parking is largely going to serve that micro neighborhood that we expect to start coming out of the ground this year. We believe that making use of the on-street parking is preferable because, one, frankly it already exists and is available and has been paid for with public funds in part, but also because we are very much concerned and want to keep a handle on the emergence of private off-street parking lots that consume otherwise developable land. And even though we will require use permits for off-site lots, those lots, we want to make sure we keep a handle on, because those lots certainly have the potential of becoming permanent or semi-permanent, and as their value increases. So we want to make sure we keep a handle on that, because our overarching goal related to parking in the Bridge District is most critical goal, given the unique facility that Rayleigh Field is that parking needs to remain available to be shared for the most part. And so to the extent that private parking lots that are dedicated to specific uses start to show up in the Bridge District, that work goes against our need to get the shared parking to make sure that facilities are available for Rayleigh Field. So we are proposing that the on-street parking be available in that district and be able to be part of the equation for those first projects that come out of the ground out there until such time is that we have enough critical mass to where, building a public lot would make sense, and where that ultimately that public lot would likely graduate into becoming a garage, at some point in the future. So if we think about how parking will evolve out there, in the Bridge District and other urban areas of town, we would expect that it would be evolved with some structured parking in the beginning, podiums for those first few projects, utilizing on-street parking, and as that demand grows to where cost-wise can be justified, we could expect to see a publicly available lot constructed, and then ultimately into a garage. The on-street parking in the beginning would be controlled to the city's residential parking permit program, similarly to what we have in the Washington neighborhood, and those permits are available annually. And as the Bridge District matures, those on-street parking could be redirected into the off-street lots and into garages, and then on-street parking becomes more and more back into the general pool for more incidental use. So we will be bringing some provisions back to the Planning Commission that allow the projects to make some use of on-street parking toward meeting what their required and market demands, would be. So with that, we'd like to close our presentation, and Sandra and myself and Maureen would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, David. Just a reminder, this is a public workshop. However, I have no request to speak at this time. David, I have a kind of a procedural question on what we're voting on or discussing tonight instead of just passing it straight off to my colleagues. Hasn't the commission already adopted parking standards for the Bridge District, specifically in that specific plan?
Yes, we have. The parking minimum maximum ratios that Sandra spoke to are already in the Bridge District. One of the things we will be bringing to you is to actually bring those to the other urban areas. The Bridge District took this to a certain degree, but there's more that needs to be done to complete, the parking program. We're really using the Bridge District really kind of as a laboratory, but there are other areas of our community that we will be we'll be urbanizing as well. So the Bridge District definitely advanced the ball, in the specific plan amendments quite a bit. Didn't take it completely all the way to where we need to go. There was still a lot of implementation from the overall citywide parking study and from the Bridge District plan itself. So we are trying to, again, keep the progress going, but we realize there are some ordinance changes that will need to come before you now as we're getting a little more close to the real world out there with real projects coming out of the ground.
So will the ordinance changes as a result of these urban parking standards affect the Bridge District?
Yes, we will be bringing this forward, and through the property owners, we'll be vetting these concepts through them. But these are all basically implementation steps that are outlined in the specific plan of things we needed to do to get ready for actual real-world development.
Thank you. I'll start on this side. Questions, comments? Jeremy?
Yeah, what metrics do you have in place to measure the success of parking plans, just in general? I mean, do you set certain measurements, or maybe that's a question for you?
There's two measures that are in place right now, and one is staff does surveys. We go out and we look around and we count cars, literally. That's taking place here in Civic Center area. And then the other indicator is parking violations through enforcement. So that's really a very good indicator for when you've got a spillover problem. For instance, in the Washington neighborhood, we have a resident preferential parking pass, so that all parking on street in the Washington neighborhood is time restricted unless you have a resident pass. So that keeps people who work in the Ziggurat or CalSTRS buildings from parking on street. And if our enforcement levels, if we get an awful lot of tickets, then we know that something's going wrong. And we'll have to look at adjusting that. So that's kind of a way to take the temperature of how well things are working.
Okay. Were those the same metrics that were probably used during the Civic Center and the library and all that?
And which are still in use, yeah.
Still in use.
And we literally go out and count cars regularly.
Okay.
Would you like to hold off or go? Mr. Chase.
Thank you. Actually, thanks to staff and Maureen for the presentation. I too could talk parking with you all day long from my past career, but one of the things I think that's really important here that you've hit on is the flexibility and the phasing as we move along, so that you can adjust to needs one way or another to again stay current and stay balanced with the right amount of parking, not too much, but not too little as well. So I think that's good. I had a question. I don't know if we have any information on it yet, but just go through some of the alternatives. On the car sharing thing, does anyone have any sense of how, I think the Zip cars have been in Sacramento for, I don't know, close to a year now. Do we have any sense of usage rate or how successful they have been?
I know I've seen a few of them here at City Hall, from time to time, and I know it's very popular on campus, at Davis. The university would seem to be an ideal location for this type of service. The principal thing about car sharing is that we would like to get to a point where if somebody were to provide dedicated car sharing spaces within their project, that could be essentially gain some credit toward overall parking. Nothing would stop anybody right now from providing a car sharing space in their project if they chose to. Right now we couldn't be able to give them any credit for that. We certainly don't, believe that there will be an explosion of this, immediately, but we definitely want to get on the track, with this, and because the whole goal, one of the goals out in the Bridge District and other urban areas, is to get some, good habits in place really from the get-go, with parking usage and transit usage, rather than trying to, apply those, remedially, down the road once everyone has already gotten used to, free-flowing parking.
Regarding the minimum maximum ratios, which I know are in effect for the Bridge District, and looking at transferring them elsewhere, I think that's excellent. I think we've seen over the years that certain retailers, Walmart, for instance, used to require 6.5 to 7 cars per 1,000 square feet because they want to park on that Christmas week day. The rest of the year, it's much less than that. So, and it is a waste of real estate and space. So I totally agree with that. The unbundling of parking costs, I'm very supportive of that. Having grown up and lived in Boston and New York City, that's all there is. I mean, you rent an apartment and then you pay almost as much to rent a parking space there. But I think it allows for options. I mean, and again, the ramping up I think is critical. That as we have the alternate modes in place, you can begin to to drop some of the parking costs, some of the actual perhaps the number of parking spaces provided. Some developers I've seen, as you unbundle this, there's an option then, rather than providing a parking space with either a condo, for sale or rental unit, to provide a parking pass for public transit, monthly, or sales, or a lifetime thing or something. So those can be options that I think a lot of people will opt for. But again, I think ramping up the concept is key to its workability here. And I also agree with the on-street parking. A lot of cities certainly use it, and you mentioned, Washington District. It may become more than just a Phase 1 option in the Bridge District. I don't know, but certainly other cities have permit, parking for the residences, and that may be a reasonable alternative on an ongoing basis to a certain extent. So, generally speaking, I think what's provided here is what I would certainly consider best practices for, working with urban parking requirements as we move forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chase. Okay. I think the theme that I heard, did you have comments?
Ditto.
Okay. The theme that I heard was time to transition. And I commend the staff on the planning foresight for smart pedestrian friendly development. It's one thing that I'm looking forward to having in the Bridge District. I think the other thing I heard tonight was the key is having a broad variety to suit multiple needs, not maybe necessarily require, but provide a variety of uses. For example, the shared cars. I think it's a good idea, and I think it's good to provide and maybe allow credit for that. I don't know if we can account for those as spaces right now, but in the future, definitely let's provide for that. I did have a question for Maureen. You addressed ownership and management of, I believe, structures, but how are we going to provide temporary surface parking? In other words, who provides it, and how do we then move into transition? Because if they're individually owned lots, you know they're not going to transition. So how do we provide these surface parking lots built for transition?
So I heard two questions. One was, how do we make sure that surface parking isn't the permanent solution? And the other is, how do we get them provided in the first place? Is that right?
How are they to be provided so they can transition?
Okay. I know my colleagues have, we had a discussion about use permits for surface parking. The specific plan in the Bridge District and the specific plan in the Washington neighborhood both prohibit surface parking, and I mean for commercial uses. And in order to provide it in these initial stages, it's an exception. So you need to get a use permit. Now, we still have to figure out how we're transitioning or when we're charging the fee that helps us finance the parking garages. So right now, all of the surface parking that's provided for Raley Field is by use permit, which gets renewed annually. And we anticipate that in order for large office buildings to be financed and so on, that we're going to have to provide something more than an annual use permit for their parking, or their lenders will never go for it. So we're still sort of struggling with some of the particulars of how that is, how the initial surface parking is provided. But it will be, what we have proposed for financing is really a big part of the urging, the hammer that we will have, because we will be requiring an in lieu payment, a contribution to the future parking structures. So the provision of parking for all new commercial uses is eventually they have to pay that fee and contribute to that. And the city will be matching that up to a certain point in financing the garages. So between the use permit being a time limit and the provision of garages and our offer of matching financing being in a carrot, we hope we've got sufficient incentive to move that forward. David might have more detail.
Well, and the other aspect of it is that the city could actually get into the parking business because the city owns property within the Bridge District. You know, the former Weyerhaeuser property, for example, that's an area where it's certainly conceivable that the city could, you know, either partner with a developer or itself, you know, construct a lot there that would be available to the public, and that it would be remain under the city's control. But we do expect over the years to be bringing various surface parking lots use permits to the Planning Commission, where we would expect those to have a time limit imposed upon them of a certain number of years, so that we can try to keep a handle on those. And we recognize in the early years, you know, we're not going to get garages, you know, right off the bat, but we also recognize that, you know, we will need parking especially in the earlier years, but we want to keep a handle on that so it doesn't get out of hand and parking lots just end up staying out there forever. You know, we need that area to build, you know, to finance the infrastructure, to support the transit, you know, and it's, you know, et cetera, and to realize the vision we have out there. So in a surface parking lot, if you, in a way, can be think of as basically a one-level garage, in that manner, because it could graduate in a garage, could be constructed with one floor, but with sufficient deck to add, layers onto it as it goes up. So, as Maureen said, we have not identified all of the mechanics, of this yet, but that is, where we're at, and we're going to be bringing some stuff before you, but there's still a lot of overall mechanics with the parking authority, the fee resolutions, things like that still need to be established, and those are things we'll be continuing to work on, probably over the next couple of years.
Thank you. I think that would be one thing I would be looking for when this comes back to us. Options that you might be looking at, just to make sure we don't get trapped into individual surface parking lots. Thank you. Is there anything that staff would like to hear from commissioners, or do you think you have enough?
Yes, I think we do. I mean, tonight we wanted to introduce some of these concepts to the Planning Commission and kind of bring back the concept of overall parking management. So, kind of remind the Planning Commission and kind of have you begin to think about some of this, and then we'll be bringing some more specifics back to you probably in one of our April meetings for some ordinance changes. But these are a part of a much larger program that we need to do to manage parking in our urban cities now that development in those areas is basically imminent.
Okay, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but the public workshop on proposed changes to the zoning ordinance regarding this topic is currently scheduled for April 19th.
Yes, that's what we're planning for right now.
All right, thank you very much. Into informal discussion. No, looking for a motion?
Motion to adjourn?
Thank you.